Ladies and gentlemen, here we are. We're on our last illiberal action on the part of, in this case, we're going to be looking at the Canadian and the U.S. government in terms of their treatment of Aboriginal people in their respective countries. So we're going to do this more chronologically. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a Canadian example of illiberalism. And that, of course, brings us to residential schools. Why were they called residential schools? Well, this is where students who were forcibly taken from their parents lived as residents. So in total, there was 139 residential schools scattered across Canada, and about 150,000 students in the existence of these schools passed through the doors. And between 2,800 and 3,200 of them died, whether it was from physical abuse, from nutritional deficiency, or from disease, right? Or from diseases like tuberculosis. So even before Canada became a country officially in 1867, there were some residential schools for Aboriginal people here in Canada. However, after Confederation, in 1867, there was the creation of something called the Indian Act. And the entire point of the Indian Act was to assimilate Indian people into, and of course that's a pejorative term now today, right? But the rationale behind residential schools was to assimilate Indians into the broader Canadian culture, right? And of course today we mentioned Indigenous. So beginning in 1876, and then there was a bit of a update to it a few years later. What they did is they issued an order, that being the government of Canada, that said that all Indigenous youths have to attend. These schools are compulsory for the so-called good of the child. And on the screen, right here in this image, you have what they termed killing the Indian in the child, or kill the Indian, save the child. So from a European Canadian perspective, right, this image here on the left versus this image here on the right, that would be seen as positive progress. That would be seen as doing a great thing. And of course, this came from a very paternalistic, from a very Eurocentric perspective, right? When you're paternalistic, you see everyone as children and you're their father and you know better than them because you're the dad, right? You just have that wisdom. So the Canadian government was incredibly paternalistic towards these children. Now, guys, in these schools, discipline was harsh, and you probably know a lot about this already as a Canadian student, right? Here in Alberta, we learn about residential schools in social studies for years and years and years, right? So you should be fairly well versed when it comes to this information. So yeah, guys, these children were forced to go there. If they spoke their mother tongue, right, they would be punished. If they wore their traditional clothes, they were punished. If they observed what were considered to be pagan holidays or rituals, they were punished. And another terrible fact that was prevalent in some residential schools was the sexual abuse that went on in these schools. Now, the last residential school closed down here in Canada in 1996, right? In 1996. Now, let me just scroll down a bit here. This image here, you can see how the schools, they were actually, they were administered. So the government provided money to different Christian denominations: Catholic Church, Methodist Church, United Church, Anglican Church, Presbyterian Church of Canada. They were all involved in the day-to-day operations of these particular schools. So in addition to the skills that these young people would be learning, which they believed were going to make them viable citizens in the Canadian economy. They were also Christianized. And guys, these students were at these schools. They're being told that, you know, their religion, their belief systems were wrong. They were being told that the languages that they used to speak were wrong. They were being told that the customs they used to observe were wrong. And then when these children were done school at the end of June and went back to see their parents in July and August before they had to go back, what this did is it created a fracturing of Indigenous communities where children basically rejected their parents as they went back. And by the time they fully went through residential schools and they got to grade 12, it created sort of like a diaspora between, you know, the younger generation and the older generation of Indigenous people in Canada. And because the young people who were educated in the residential school system didn't want to stay on the reserve lands that the government set aside for them, right, with their families and things like that, they would often go to cities in order to find jobs. But they were educated in a subpar system, which meant that they didn't have the skills they needed to be competitive. And what do you do when you're in the big city and you have no other options? Well, you resort to a life of crime. And I actually think that, you know, where you see higher incidence of alcohol dependency, drug dependency, criminality, etc. I think a lot of these issues that we see in our Indigenous peoples here in Canada has to do with the experience of residential schools and how it just fractured communities. Now, in the year 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper officially apologized for residential schools. And if you want to see that, you can just go on to YouTube and just search, you know, Residential School Apology Canada, and you will find the video. And it was a beautiful moment of healing. Now, even before that, in 2006, there was something created called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, often called the TRC, and you can see that right here. So the TRC, the whole point of it was the idea that to speak about your experiences promotes healing. It promotes catharsis. It helps you move forward and deal with that ugly past. And survivors of residential schools had the opportunity to speak their experiences. So 7 major Canadian cities held TRC gatherings, and also smaller communities across Canada also held gatherings of the TRC, and thousands of former residential school survivors came forward. They gave, you know, hundreds of hours worth of testimony, and it produced a 6-volume report, right, as this is on the screen, in terms of how to move forward, right? How do we better integrate our Indigenous peoples into the Canadian fabric? And unfortunately, a lot of what came forth after the TRC and that report was produced never actually came to light. So it was a lot of talk, but not a lot of action, which is very unfortunate. Now, that's residential schools, the TRC, what you should understand. So just understand, guys, that as soon as Europeans showed up to this side of the world, there was just this tension between European-based society and Indigenous society. And the Europeans believed they were better, and as a result, it was their job to assimilate and to change these Indigenous people into more so like Europeans, right? Now, I mentioned tension, and in 1990 in Oka, Quebec, the tension between European Canadians and Indigenous Canadians, in this case, it was a group known as the Mohawks of the Gennesautauqui in Quebec. This tension boiled over into what we call today the Oga Crisis. So for 78 days here in Canada in 1990, we had basically a standoff between the Gennesautauqui Mohawks, and at first it was the Quebec Provincial Police known as the SQ, or the Sûreté de Quebec, and then also the RCMP, and then eventually the Canadian military, right? The army was called in. Now the question is, why? Why did it escalate to this? And the answer is, it all comes down to the game of golf, right? So the town of Oka had a 9-hole golf course, and they wanted to expand their golf course into an 18-hole golf course. However, and they're also going to build a condominium project as well in that area. But to do this, they would have to basically clear the Pines, an area called the Pines, which was a ancient Mohawk burial ground. And when the town of Oka decided to go ahead with this expansion of the golf course and the condo project, the Mohawks around the town of Oka got upset. Now, why were they upset? Well, the land that was guaranteed to them actually was guaranteed to them in treaties which predated Canadian Confederation. In fact, these treaties went back to like the 1600s, back when New France existed, long before Canada was even a thought, right? So they were upset, and they started a blockade to ensure that the equipment to clear the Pines could not make it. Now, because the Mohawks were stifling the development of the golf course and the condominium project, they called in the Quebec Provincial Police. And once the QPP showed up, or the SQ as they call them in French, it led to an exchange of fire between the Mohawks and the SQ. And in that exchange of fire, right, about a 15-minute firefight, one SQ officer tragically got struck by a bullet and it killed him, right? Hit him in the face, and then it caused him to die. And at that point, the SQ backed out, RCMP moved in, and then they were eventually backed up by Canadian Army units. And as you can see here in this image on the screen, right, you can see Canadian forces, Army soldiers, confronting the Mohawks of Gennesautauqui. And perhaps the most, one of the more famous images in Canadian history is this image that we see on the screen here. So on the right, we have the warrior by the name of Lasagna. Yes, that was his name. He wrote a book about the Oka Crisis after. So you can see Lasagna on the right. You have the Canadian Forces soldier on the left. And basically, you know, I just, when I see this image, I think of the tension, again, that goes back to residential schools and how this is just all those tensions between white Canada and Indigenous Canada sort of boiling over in hostilities and frustration. And Lasagna was trying to bait or goad the young servicemen here into doing something foolish, and he never did. Now, just so you're aware, after 78 days, the Canadian Army captured different areas around the town of Oka, right? The Mercier Bridge in Montreal was seized by different bands and things like that. Eventually, the only area that the Mohawks still controlled was the actual area around the Pines. And the army moved in, and then the Mohawk warriors, and by this time there was about 600 of them, they eventually laid down their weapons after they were told by the females, according to the Iroquois Confederacy, to give it up. This, in fact, was a very matriarchal society. So they gave up their weapons, they burned tobacco as a sign of peace, and as they came out of the Pines, they were arrested. And if you watch that video by Grant Hill, Oga Crisis in 5 minutes, you will see sort of the melee that happened at the end. They were told that they're going to be able to go free, but once they walked out of the Pines, they were quickly rounded up by the Canadian military, and many of them face arrest, although most of them were later let off in terms of charges. Now, guys, the Oga Crisis is a great example of Indigenous resistance here in Canada. And then in 2012, there is a movement born known as Idle No More. Idle No More was symptomatic of a lot of issues that were going on in Indigenous communities in Canada. Things like poverty, things like environmental degradation, things like lack of opportunity, drug abuse, all sorts of different issues, right? And in 2012, this campaign called Idle No More, which started in Canada, started to spread throughout the world. Now, the term idle means to do nothing. And at this point, I guess, Indigenous peoples in Canada reached sort of a level of consciousness that they decided they're not going to stand back and watch what the Creator in their eyes has made for them be destroyed. And another issue that we see coming to the forefront of Idle No More was the Attawapiskat suicide crisis that happened in the northern Ontario town of Attawapiskat. And the elder, the chief of that particular Indigenous band named Teresa Spence was on a hunger strike, so they were rallying to her support. I put a video of a protester from Grassy Narrows, which is also in Ontario, about 100 miles upstream from them. There was a pulp and paper mill, and in order to bleach the paper, they used mercury amongst other chemicals. And then, of course, those chemicals run downstream, and there were people dying in Grassy Narrows from mercury poisoning, etc., right? So all these issues in 2012, the disenfranchisement, the lack of political power, the lack of sovereignty, the environmental destruction, the poverty, all these different things sort of boiled to the surface with this movement called Idle No More. So again, when I think Idle No More, I just think of the continuation of Indigenous resistance. And then finally, this image here at the bottom, we continue to see more Indigenous resistance. In this case, it was in the United States of America. So there was a group known as the Standing Rock Sioux who were opposed to the creation of something known as the Dakota Access Pipeline. This pipeline started in North Dakota. It would go through into South Dakota and then eventually end off in the American state of Illinois. Now, in order to have this pipeline be completed, it would have to cross the Missouri River, and that river was the lifeblood. It was the water supply of the Standing Rock Sioux. And they opposed a pipeline which could potentially leak and poison their water supply. So they, again, became they started to protest against the creation of this pipeline. And the protests lasted from April of 2016 all the way to February of the next year. And eventually, guys, what happens is the police were called in, and then near the end of Obama's second term, he actually called off the Dakota Access Pipeline. So it looked like the protest was actually going to work. However, when Trump came back into office, or when Trump got voted in on his fourth day in office after his inauguration on January 24th, 2017, he signs an executive order basically saying the Dakota Access Pipeline and also something known as the Keystone XL Pipeline, which you've probably heard of, were going ahead, and they basically scrapped the environmental consultation going on and they pushed the project through. Why? Because capitalism, because profit, because of money, because of the economy, etc. So we see sort of this tension between capitalist profit and preserving what Indigenous people refer to as, the Creator's land, right? The land that the Creator made for us. So yeah, guys, and unfortunately, with all the protesting and things like that, it seemed like quite often the Indigenous people were often on the short end of the stick, right? Too often we see Indigenous people being ignored in Canada or the United States, and their contributions to society being ignored. So, I mean, they've been treated rather illiberally during the time that European people have been here in the so-called New World. So yeah, guys, please, if you haven't had a look at the videos in the module kind of talking more about Idle No More and the Keystone XL Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline, right, Oga Crisis, etc., please make sure you have a look. All right, so that is it for this video. I love you guys. Peace. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, hopefully we'll see each other soon. Bye.